Um, Reverend Brian is a lifelong Chicagoan from the South Side. He spent most of his years growing up in the suburbs of Elmhurst, Illinois, where he went to high school and college, worked for over a decade in local pharmacy and the town library. His spiritual upbringing is a combination, right? Catholic, Anglican, and then the UU or Unitarian Universalism. That's where he spent the most of his formative years and heard his call to ministry. He got his degree in theology and religion from Elmhurst College in 2008. Then he went on to seminary and graduated in 2014 from Meadville Lombard in Chicago. He's been in multiple congregations. He's working on his doctorate at Boston. Is that correct? Perfect.
At Boston U. Yeah.
Is that a PhD in theology?
It would be a doctor of ministry.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I just finished mine. Hopefully it doesn't take you as long as it did mine. So he's really passionate about sharing about his UU faith and outside of church and life and all the studying. He enjoys reading, writing, experiencing different cultures, hiking, and exploring new places, especially small towns, America. He's a fan of baseball, always cheering on his White Sox. His husband, Dan, and him are comic book fans and boast of over a collection of 13,000 comics. That is incredible. Plus a 90-pound Rottweiler. And you are coming today to us from Lexington. Is that correct?
Yes, from Lexington, Kentucky. Yep.
Perfect. Well, we are so glad to have you. And usually our times, our speakers kind of will present to us, and then we'll provide a space of question and answer. And every week's a little different, so don't feel like you have to fit a particular mold. And we just are so thankful that you can be with us today, and we turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. So thank you for having me. It's great to connect over Zoom. Though I was looking forward to the drive, so one day I need to get down there. So that I love driving and just going. So yeah, you mentioned a lot. Real quick, if you look at the books behind me, like there are a lot of comic books, like paperbacks, so it's not all scholarly stuff. So it just still looks imposing. But it's great to be here, and I want to begin with just something very simple. As I'm about to share about Unitarian Universalism, this is how Unitarian Universalists start nearly every gathering where they join together. And it is a very simple ritual. And it often involves something that looks like this. It's what we call a chalice. This is more of a traditional one for Unitarian Universalists. This one is fallen and broken and shattered on the ground, so it's got all sorts of cracks in it, and it makes it more beautiful that way. And just a simple candle in it. And we just light a simple candle at the beginning of most of our meetings. In our worship services, we light sort of a bigger official chalice. However, the flame is always very simple. And it means so many different things to everyone who joins in at our congregations and our meetings. For me, it represents that the spark of hope can never be extinguished, no matter what. It also reminds us that, I guess the scriptural phrase of where two or three are gathered, we acknowledge that there is something happening here. Some people call it the Spirit, some people call it God. Whatever people want to call it, it is good and right, and it unites us in that moment. And so I will just light a simple chalice flame here. And it doesn't have to be official. It can be a tea light. It can be one of those candle lighting apps on your phone. It can be whatever is close at hand, or even you can just visualize it. And to center yourself and just kind of bring what you need into this moment, right? And for me today, it is joining with all of you in the spirit of both learning, but also in the spirit of sharing. And that is what I've lit this chalice flame for this morning. So I'm going to present some broad strokes here of what Unitarian Universalism is, and then move specifically into some of our current justice initiatives, which span across so many different areas, and then open it up for questions. So if for whatever, at any point during this, you do have questions, I certainly welcome them. I love history. Sometimes the congregation will be like, oh boy, there goes Reverend Brian with another history sermon. But I love to bring history alive, but I won't get into the nitty gritty details. I'll really just try to give you the broad strokes here. And if you have any other specific questions, that's great. So we'll begin with the name, Unitarian Universalism. It's 11 syllables, and it's a long name for a religious tradition. It's funny, we have a small children's book that is What is Unitarian Universalism, and it teaches them how to say it. But even some of our adults always mix it up, and they'll go Universal Unitarianism, and they'll mix it up. And if you flip the names, it's perfectly acceptable too. Universalist, Unitarian. We have some churches that are named that way, but officially it's Unitarian Universalism. We see ourselves as a distinct religious tradition that comes out of Protestant Christianity. However, in the 1960s, we recognized that a shift happened in our religious kind of structure and our beliefs, that we stepped outside of Protestant Christianity and became our own religious tradition. Christianity is still very important to us. It is a part of our tradition. However, in the 1960s, we made that intentional decision to both steward our past and also be open to so much more as well. But that's jumping ahead. So how did we even get to this 11-syllable name? Well, if you break it down, so we have the Unitarians and the Universalists, and they were both two distinct Protestant traditions at one point. And when you look through history, you see that the ideas of Unitarianism and Universalism have been with Christianity since the very beginning. You look at the early church, they were debating Unitarian ideas and Universalist ideas. And so in many ways, we've been on the wrong side of history in that we didn't win the day at the councils. There's always the famous meme that you see going around of St. Patrick punching Arius at one of the Nicene councils, and Arius was a Unitarian, so he got punched in the face by St. Patrick. Or was it St. Nicholas? I think it was St. Nicholas. I mixed up my saints. It's the Irish thing. So St. Nicholas punching Arius. So we've been around in various ways, shapes, and forms since the very beginning. And throughout most of the history of Christianity, Unitarians and Universalists have been considered heretical traditions. Now, that might be a serious word in some places. It's a word we embrace. Heretical, at its very basic, means that you choose to believe differently. You choose a different way. And in Unitarian Universalism, we celebrate the diversity of belief and in choosing a different way. So it's not a terrible label for us. It's something that we celebrate every single day that we're Unitarian Universalists. So what did Unitarianism and Universalism believe? So traditionally, Unitarians believe that God is one, which isn't a controversial idea for many religious traditions. But for the Unitarians, it was in direct opposition to the Trinitarian viewpoint that most Christians held, which is God is Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The Unitarians said, we don't necessarily affirm the Trinity. God is one, which led to a lot of interesting debates and conversations around who Jesus was, what Jesus meant to Unitarianism. Some people said Jesus was divine and was part of the unity of God, right? Some Unitarians said Jesus was really just a special man. And some people had all sorts of other definitions of what that was. And that's the traditional belief right there. Universalism often affirmed the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, but said that every single human being, no matter what, is eventually reconciled unto God, that all were eventually saved. And that, of course, is the traditional view there. Now, the question I always get when I talk about universalism, people immediately go to Hitler or other tyrants and other destructive, evil people throughout history, right? And so what am I going to say? Am I going to say Hitler is saved, right? And that's always the question I get, which is kind of funny. But when you look traditionally at the Universalists, they leaned more into the idea of mystery, that they don't know how God reconciles all. They don't know how God reconciles those who are wicked, those who destroyed life, those who exacted significant evil upon our world. But they trusted that God would eventually reconcile. The joke in seminary is that God is the Universalist. I'm just working on it. And it doesn't mean human beings need to be, oh yeah, there's great evil in the world and great, you're saved. That's wonderful, right? But it's leaning into the mystery, the idea that we don't understand God fully. We have glimpses of God in a variety of scriptural traditions that are given to us. We have experiences of God that are outside of scriptural traditions that the mystics in every religious tradition have given to us and that we've received. And so that's kind of how the Universalists approach this topic. Now, I kept saying that those are the traditional beliefs of those two traditions, and there's a reason I keep saying that way. Throughout the 1900s up to the 1960s, the Unitarians and Universalists got a lot more, they got similar. They kept getting closer and closer together. They started working together. Their youth groups were the first to emerge in the 1930s and 40s. You don't have to write any of this down, but it became clear that the two traditions were already uniting. And when they united in 1961, they became the Unitarian Universalists. Those traditional beliefs weren't necessarily as important to the traditions then. So the idea of one unified God and universal salvation. There's still things that we think are important, still things that we want to lean into mystery over. And yet we have room for so many other understandings within our tradition. So in 1961, they united and they signified that this is a step outside of Protestant Christianity. And so today, I serve a congregation that has atheists, agnostics, people who are non-theists. They're not really sure, and it's not a question that they really particularly want to ask. I have people who identify as Christian, Buddhist. I have a couple families that one of the spouses or both of the spouses grew up in India, and their familiarity is with a variety of Hindu practice and tradition. We have people from all walks of life, people who celebrate earth-centered, nature-based religion. Oftentimes that falls under neo-pagan, which another buzzword that might stir up some feelings there. But we have Wiccans, we have people who feel especially drawn to Druidic practice, or people who really just want to center their religious practice in nature. So we have this whole breadth of understanding in our midst. It's not just those traditional beliefs that I mentioned from the Unitarians and the Universalists. I have people who believe in the Trinity in the congregation, and that's good and right. People who value the teachings of Jesus, but really just see him as a man, and that's good and right in our tradition. Now, it might sound like if you grew up in a Christian tradition, you certainly know the verse that the road is narrow, right? The narrow road versus the wide and broad road. That's another thing where we certainly celebrate the breadth of our diversity. We are not bound to a specific religious scriptural tradition. In fact, most of the books behind me, in some way, shape, or form, a Unitarian Universalist could identify as scriptural, as long as it brings about something that is life-affirming and life-giving, and something that inspires us. And so we're different. We're very different. We still call ourselves a church. If you were to come to a service on Sunday morning, it would feel very familiar if you grew up in a Protestant tradition. If you are familiar with the Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, they were Unitarians, and they certainly inform us today. In many ways, we have much more in common with the Transcendentalists than we do with the Protestant Christian wing of our tradition. But it's interesting, on Sunday morning, you find people from all walks of life, and yet they somehow manage to get along. They somehow manage to be the church, to be a community, to work toward that beloved community. And so what unites us, if not a single belief, are our values, our ethical values, how we want to shape our relationships with one another. What's common in today is that, I don't need to tell you this, you just need to turn on the news. Whatever your preferred news channel is, whatever your preferred news source is, there it is that there's a growing division and this understanding that we can't bridge those divisions, that suddenly someone who believes differently than me is my enemy, or is someone I can't talk to or don't want to talk to. For Unitarian Universalists, the atheists versus the theists, that isn't a thing. They can still make community happen, right? And so it's our values. It's what we call right relationship, or our covenants. Not necessarily Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the covenant, but it's the promises that we make with one another of how we're going to relate. And so the basis of that is what we call the 7 principles. And the 7 principles are ethical statements that, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who disagrees with them. And I'll just give you a couple of them. The first one says that every single human being has worth and dignity. It doesn't say they're good, it doesn't say they're evil, but it says no matter what, everyone has worth and dignity. And then jump ahead. What is kind of the central principle is that we affirm a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, wherever that leads you. You'll notice it says free, but it also says responsible. And the way that I interpret that is that if you are affirming a belief that is not life-affirming or life-giving, that marginalizes people, that furthers oppression, that makes people feel less than worthy, that ostracizes people, that is a belief Unitarian Universalists will not deem worthy and responsible. Then we have our seventh principle, which talks about the interconnected web of existence of which we are all a part. Fanciful language that basically reminds us that we are interconnected to everything that is in this world and in this universe, that we are not separate from nature, but are a part of nature. And that makes stewarding creation, stewarding the natural world, the looming climate crisis that is here. We certainly affirm that that is here. It's not something that's off in the distance. We're already seeing the effects of that, that we are responsible to the natural world. And we are not the overlords of it. We are one part of it. And we certainly have a responsibility to lessen the effects of human-caused climate change. We also have something new. While we have 7 principles, many congregations are adopting what's called an 8th principle. And I'll just talk about that briefly because Canada has already done it and dozens of congregations. We were one of the first to do it. And what it does is it makes anti-oppression work fundamental to our faith. And what it talks about is that Unitarian Universalists are intentional about building a multicultural, diverse, beloved community that dismantles oppression within ourselves, our institutions, and the wider world. And so while we've always been a social justice oriented religion, now it's becoming fundamental to the faith. It's not something that we want to rationalize. It's something that we want to actively participate, that there are oppressions that I have grown up in. I am a white male in America. And so it is up to me to examine the privileges that I have been given with very little work. And how do I dismantle those and also speak truth to power, knowing all of this? To look at women's healthcare. How do I advocate for women's rights and women's healthcare and access to that and have a good conversation about that? During my intro here, it was mentioned that I am LGBTQ. I am an openly gay man and I am married and I serve a church as a minister. And so how do I center the rights of LGBTQ persons, specifically focusing on genderqueer, non-binary, and trans, because they often get left out of the LGBTQ conversation. Also, Black Lives Matter. We certainly affirm Black Lives Matter. We certainly affirm dismantling what we call white supremacy culture and centering equity and further things in that strain. We ordain women openly. We ordain trans individuals, gay individuals, lesbian individuals. If you go back in history, we've been ordaining women for some time. You go far enough back, traditions will be arguing about who was first in ordaining women. I don't think that's important. I think it's important that several traditions made the leap around the same time. And we were certainly among those traditions that did. We've been ordaining LGBTQ individuals since the 60s and 70s, and we've been affirming same-sex unions unofficially since the 60s and 70s, but officially since the 90s, and we certainly were in the fight for marriage equality as well. Now, I could keep going about our work in anti-oppression work, multicultural work, and anti-racist work. But you'll often see us at protests, and we often have yellow shirts on that say "on the side of love," and that's how you know a Unitarian Universalist is there. We tend to pop up wherever there's a fight for justice or equality. I want to make sure. Okay, someone sent me a question about human sexuality, so I want to center on that a little bit. So you've got this tradition that is that claims the heretical label, that claims the progressive label. And so we are a very progressive religious tradition. It does mean we do have some conservative members, and that's great. And we invite people to navigate that in a way that makes sense for them, right? We don't shun people because of their politics. We invite them into the conversation to navigate that in a way that makes sense with them. If you believe in a politics or a worldview that doesn't affirm worth and dignity, Unitarian Universalism might not be for you, right? And we need to be honest about that. So I want to focus on some of our work around human sexuality and LGBTQ issues specifically. So Unitarian Universalists affirm human sexuality. It is a part of who we are. It is not something that makes us dirty or unworthy. We certainly don't tell the narrative of the fall and how sexuality might play into that, and in propagating this understanding of original sin. We don't have that understanding. We've been fierce advocates of ensuring that our youth have been educated around human sexuality, especially in areas where that is not available to them. So in the 1990s, you can find this, and I interned at the church where this all sprung out in Concord, Massachusetts in the 1990s. There were articles, it was on the news. You could probably find them in archives and stuff about, oh my God, there is a church teaching preschoolers about sex, right? And it was a massive controversy. Okay, so what the news often portrays is really, they want good headlines and they want to dig into this. What they were doing is teaching preschoolers and kindergartens about what are appropriate boundaries and how do you name body parts, right? How do you get comfortable in naming those boundaries? It was a way to educate our youth and parents, because parents are primary sexuality educators. That's what we always say, around how to have conversations with your children, and also what's age appropriate. So if something inappropriate is happening to a child, they need to have the language and tools to tell that to their parents or to tell that to adults that they trust. And so early sexuality education for our children is all about boundaries. When we get into middle school, yes, we do teach our children about sex. We teach them about gender identity. We teach them about being LGBTQ. We teach them about what does it mean to be cisgendered or straight. Every UU child has to go through this rite of passage where there are these hand-drawn slides that we have to watch in the program. And it's called Our Whole Lives, which is sexuality education. We call it OWL for short, OWL. And we all have to go through these slides as middle schoolers that show a variety of sexual positions and people being together. But it is full, honest, and science-backed understandings of sexuality. And UU children and youth always share the same rites of passage, where when we're adults, we're like, hey, do you remember that slide we had to see? Do you remember the one with there's two people on a rock in like the middle of the ocean? Why were they in the ocean? And so it kind of gets funny when you're a UU youth, but we get the education that we need that you probably don't get in school. We don't teach abstinence-only education because we're honest, we're realistic about human sexuality. And so our youth have the tools to navigate that. It's not just for our youth, though. We talk about human sexuality education as UUs from preschool and kindergarten to seniors. And we have curricula for that because we don't stop being sexual beings, right? It's with us and it's a part of our faith. Why would part of our humanity not be a part of our faith? It seems to Unitarian Universalists, it seems a little bizarre that we would section off a part of our humanity and say this has nothing to do with faith right here. So we have young adult educational opportunities. We have it for adults. We have it for and for seniors as well. And it's a variety of things that try to meet the needs of those age groups when they are, want to talk about sexuality education. There's a lot going on and it's constantly being updated. So we just released a few years ago revisions to the curriculum that center on, and as I mentioned before, we often feel that queer, non-binary, genderqueer, trans individuals get left out of the LGBTQ conversation. And so we revised those curricula to talk about issues of gender, to talk about pronouns, to talk about having that conversation with parents. Again, remember, parents are primary sexuality educators. And when you're an adult, you become your own sexuality educator. Of course, you can have spouses and friends that want to be a part of that conversation. So we revamped all those curricula to talk about these things, to not just equip people with the tools that they need to navigate those questions, right? And to know that there's a community that will navigate those questions with them, but to make our communities more welcoming. We have a program that's called Welcoming Congregations, and it does center on being welcoming to LGBTQ individuals. And so a lot of the new work around that is in navigating pronouns. So my pronouns are he, him, his, and getting congregation members more comfortable in using that language and in honoring the pronouns or the names that people want to have honored. So the congregation I serve is, it's got a ways to go, but it's doing quite well in navigating that conversation. Some other congregations are leagues ahead of where we are, and some are just beginning. But what's important is that Unitarian Universalists are constantly invited into, again, that language of life affirming and life giving and centering the worth and dignity of every individual, which is difficult. That is difficult, and that could be a lifetime's work alone. I don't know about you, but centering someone's worth and dignity is hard these days, especially that we're now 20 months into a pandemic and we're kind of settling into this sense of languishing and malaise. And I've noticed people are angrier now that we're 20 months in. I'm angrier, and I find myself reacting in ways I've never reacted to things, and I have to really intentionally step back and breathe. As mentioned, I'm a Chicagoan. If you've ever driven in Chicago, it is a blood sport. It is not as intense as, say, Boston, where I also lived. But Chicago driving, you really don't want to affirm worth and dignity on the road. You're just like, get out of my way, you're my enemy. And we often have the one finger salute in Chicago if you're driving in the city. But I also have to step back and evaluate that, right? Is this the best way to affirm someone's worth and dignity on the road? I don't know what people are going through day in and day out. And that's a very simple example, right? Driving, right? That's so simple. It's getting an email that you don't like. It's a professor telling you something you don't want to know, or one of your supervisors telling you something that you just don't want to deal with. The simple things is a good place to start around that conversation of worth and dignity. Because Unitarian Universalists are invited to have that, not just with emails and cars and things that annoy us, but with the breadth of humanity. And that includes people that we don't agree with, people we don't want to like, or issues that we're struggling with. So we're invited in that conversation of worth and dignity, whether it's around, for an example, like the gender pay inequality, right? That is a reality in our world, or immigration rights. We're invited into that conversation. LGBTQ rights and human sexuality conversations. We're invited in that conversation. So it is all encompassing. And our communities provide sort of a laboratory for people to have those conversations and to explore those conversations. And it's not just into the nitty gritty issues of oppression in humanity, right? It's into the big spiritual questions. So if you grew up with an understanding that God is vengeful, we have a lot of people that come to our tradition that are leaving those traditions. And so how do you own your religious past? How do you have compassion for yourself there? And if you still believe in God, how do you come to believe in a God of love? Or, how do you discover what that means for you? How do people discover maybe God isn't an important question for them? What are the important spiritual questions for you, right? And if you're struggling with them, to have that moment of compassion and to see what you discover in that. So that's really what our communities are about. I'm sure I'm missing a million things here. I could talk all day about both our history. If you wanted me to talk about transcendentalists, I could certainly do that. But all of this is presented, I'll end with this, right? I've mentioned a lot of things, sort of this radical history of ours, and it's all over the world, right? The oldest Unitarian communities still in existence are in Transylvania in Romania. So they'll sell you tchotchkes about vampires, but Transylvania has nothing to do with vampires. It's the rural villages. They are all Unitarian, and they have Unitarian churches that are hundreds of years old. And so we have close connection, and they still identify as solely Christian. They have bishops, which we don't have in the United States. We're Congregationalists that are somehow loosely affiliated with one another. And so Transylvania has an interesting expression of Unitarianism. We have one of our largest congregations is in the Philippines, and they speak in tongues there, though they may not identify solely as Christian. And so what does that look like, right? We have Unitarian congregations in the Khalsi Hills of India. with their own unique expression that weaves in this sort of Christian narrative with Hindu practice and all the diversity of India. And so wherever you look to Unitarian Universalist expressions, there's always an invitation to honor the diversity and the breadth of humanity and to figure it out together. It's not always easy, and that's what leads to this point here, is that I've talked about these issues, this diversity, this history we have, women's health and rights. Not all Unitarian Universalists are pro-choice, right? We have people who identify as pro-life. Let's have that conversation. Not all Unitarian Universalists are liberals or progressives. We do have some conservatives. How do we talk about the LGBTQ conversation? How do we talk about Black Lives Matter? How do we talk about George Floyd, right? Breonna Taylor, some recent examples. Not everyone wants to have that conversation, but how do we enter into that? It's not all rainbows and sunshine, which Unitarian Universalism can sometimes sound like. It's hard, because being in community is hard, but it's worth it. And that is why we affirm communities like churches, congregations, and you'll find that we call them a variety of things: societies, fellowships, congregations, churches, whatever. The important thing is being in community. So it's interesting to navigate that with people week after week that not only have a variety of spiritual beliefs, but a variety of backgrounds. Increasingly, we find that there's diversity beyond just having the spiritual and our backgrounds. We're being intentional about racial diversity. And it's not of how do we get people in our congregations, it's more how do we get comfortable talking about race and issues of race and not making people feel marginalized when they visit us. So it's hard, but it's good. And our principles aren't meant to be easy. You can read our principles, go, yeah, I agree with that, blah, 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 blah. But how are you living them in your life? And to circle back to the sexuality education and the LGBTQ issue, that I feel is one of the easiest examples of how we apply that to our lives. Affirming our worth and dignity is ensuring that everyone is equipped to navigate issues of sexuality and the education around sexuality. So there's a lot there. I'll pause for a moment. I'm happy to expand upon things. I threw a lot at you, and I certainly left a lot out. So if I said anything confusing, I've been accused of being a fast talker and leaving things out, thinking I told them to you. So I want to invite if there's any immediate questions.
I have a question, Reverend Brian, which is so helpful. I know we're asking you to summarize this really profound tradition in 25 minutes, so that's impossible, but you've done a really good job for that. But you had mentioned when people come in with a kind of a faith tradition that may be, like, I think you said wrathful or vengeful, that kind of thing. What do you say to people who are coming from a text-based tradition where maybe they're kind of exploring their own sexuality and they hear things that like the Bible says or this holy book says? What do you say to that?
So that's an interesting place, and it does depend on where people are coming from. But if they're coming into our congregations, I feel I have a good starting place here because they're asking questions, they're exploring. One example I have is someone new started coming to the congregation. She only has attended online, and now that we've started doing some in-person things, she's wading into it. But she comes out of a religious tradition that was severely fundamentalist. And it was one of the traditions where if you leave, you lose your friends, your family, everything. And so she lost everything. And that's heartbreaking. That is absolutely heartbreaking when people don't even have a choice in this is a severe sort of blow to her dignity, right? Her way of navigating the world. And so that's a hard conversation to have. And she may not be ready for that conversation for a while. And my role and the church's role and Unitarian Universalism's role is to provide that sense of sanctuary and safety for people who are navigating that. We want to work toward healing and wholeness, but we also want to recognize that some people might not be ready. But when people are ready, now I love the Bible. I love scriptures. right? I would love to talk about the Holy Quran, right? I would love to talk about the Book of Mormon, which is such a unique American expression of religion. I would love to talk about the Dhammapada of the Buddhists or the Tao Te Ching of the Taoists. I would love to talk about all of these representations and the breadth of diversity in Scripture. And this includes the Bible, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures. And so if people want to have that conversation around it, let's meet them where they are, and let's open up that text. And I would want them to give me what's in here that is making you feel ostracized, that's making you feel less than worthy. What is it that you were told about the Bible says, right? Let's have that conversation. It's not my job to convince them that it says something otherwise, but I can certainly invite them to having that conversation around, oh my goodness, let's look at Leviticus 18, which is one of the classic clobber verses against LGBTQ people, clobber chapters. Like, there's plenty of good stuff in there. Like, I think 2 verses there. Let's talk about, what is it, 1822? I might be forgetting. Let's talk about that and position that verse both in the cultural context. Who was writing this? Why were they writing it? What did it mean? What was left out? And what could it mean for us today? And let's have a conversation about how we approach the Bible. And I'm so grateful to so many Christian communities across the world right now that are reframing the conversation around the Bible. How can it still be a meaningful book that you love, that you cherish, and yet you struggle with? And so there are some great books out there now that are about decolonizing the Bible and centering the Bible in new ways from oppressed identities and marginalized identities. One great new one was called the Deconstructionalist's Handbook, I think it was called. I have it. Do I have it? I have it, I think. And then there's, the Deconstructionist Playbook. And it's all about looking at the Bible through marginalized identities, through the Black Lives Matter movement, through queer identities, through a variety of standpoints, through being a dreamer, right? There's also, let's see, Take Back the Word. It's a little older, but it's also about how do you look at the Bible and have the conversation around sexuality. There's a great one I just got. It's about queering Paul's epistles, right? When you look at the authentic letters of Paul, there's still some things inserted in there that make women go, no, I want nothing to do with this. And LGBTQ people go, to heck with you, Paul. I don't want to deal with you. And so how do we reframe that conversation away from a fundamentalist understanding of the text of, well, it says this in English, therefore it must be. And how do we have a richer, more inviting conversation around what this text meant and could mean for us? And I'll go right out and say, I am a gay man who is serving a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and I am a radical liberal. I love the Apostle Paul. He is one of my favorite people in the Bible, in the Christian scriptures. I love Paul. And when you look at the Hebrew scriptures, I love the people who are messing up left and right. King Hezekiah is one of my favorites, right? Moses and his reluctance to lead is one of my favorites. The congregation accuses me of having favorites for everything, but I do love the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, and I love having those conversations with people. I'm not going to approach it from, it says this, therefore it must mean this. I'm going to invite people into that deeper conversation.
That's really, really helpful. I wonder if others have any questions that they want to offer. Unmute yourself and ask, or maybe put in the chat. This would be a great time to ask. Well, as people are thinking about their questions that they may have, you've mentioned a lot about kind of your own journey, but also this beautiful tradition of the UU. Let's say a person's in Eastern Kentucky, they've never heard of the UUs. You're the first 30 minutes they've ever heard about it, and now they want to plug in. How would they begin to find out more, to maybe even virtually worship? Like, could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So one of the gifts of the pandemic is that it has moved religious traditions into the digital sphere, sometimes kicking and screaming, but they're there nonetheless. And so you can find a Unitarian Universalist congregation. We think it's very critically important. I left out the conversation around accessibility and neurodiversity. So that's another conversation to have. But we think that having multi-platform worship in perpetuity is an issue of accessibility and engaging people across neurodiverse perspectives. And also safety. There are people who right now cannot get the vaccine for a variety of reasons. I have a congregation member who's undergoing chemo, and the vaccine is worthless to her right now because it just destroys her immune system. And so to continue to make worship accessible, you can find a UU congregation anywhere in the country if you want, wherever we are. I would invite you to explore that. Whether or not it's Lexington, Kentucky, it'd be great to have you. And I know Pikeville is a bit of a hike to Lexington, but it would be great to see you. Or if you want to try out another congregation, you can try out Washington, D.C. if you want. You could try out a congregation in Chicago. You can find one that works for you, because each UU congregation is a little different. The church that I grew up in was very rationalist, right? Very humanist. It had a lot of particle physicists from Fermilab there that attended there. And so that changed the dynamic of the congregation. But where I first interned in Chicago, it was old school Universalists, and they wanted to clap and sing and dance, and like conga lines would break out, and it was exuberant. People would pass out the drums, and the place was booming every Sunday. So completely different expressions of our religious tradition. Here in Lexington, it's kind of a crossroads. We got it all, and it's hard to meet the needs of all, but you get a kind of a breadth of experience with us. So I'd invite you to find something that works for you. I'd try it out. UUs are not going to corner you and make you sign up to become a member. We are terrible at evangelization, absolutely terrible. And maybe one day we'll figure it out. But it begins with the invitation. Bring your whole self, who you are, because it is worthy, and you have dignity, and we want you to bring that. And figure out if it's right for you. Unitarian Universalism is a religion of the conscience. You have to come to that understanding for yourself, and you might join with us if you check us out and you're like, hey, this is great. You might join with us, and it might be just for a chapter of your life, and that's okay, right? We are there, and we will welcome people no matter what. So you can find us online, and again, explore. Figure it out. We're kind of past the era where people come to us because they went to beliefnet.com and took the quiz of what religion are you. You could still do that if you want, but every now and then people will still do that. Mostly we have people that come in because they're driving by, or they wander up, or they go to the website and they see that we are passionate about environmental justice, or they see the Black Lives Matter banners, or the LGBTQ affirming banners. Or the banner outside the church that says all genders are whole, holy, and good, and women's rights are human rights. Things like that tend to be what draw people to us these days. Yeah, we're there, and feel free to check us out. Again, we will not corner you and force you to sign up or do any of that. We want to make sure that is your decision. And if you visit us once, that's great. It's wonderful. If you come back, we'd love to have you.
Another question, when it comes to your own, when you kind of said you felt a call to be a minister, to be a clergy person, and did you face any opposition when it came to your sense of call, or other people around you, or when you moved to a place like Lexington and people find out about you? Do you deal with any opposition? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So in the UU tradition, we have a very difficult ordination process. We tend to compete with Lutherans and Episcopalians for who has the most difficult ordination process. So how much paperwork can we throw at you, and how many tests and panels, and oh my goodness. So it's really enduring that. That was the biggest opposition that I received. And it's hard for a reason. And for Unitarian Universalists, sometimes we get people that come to us and just like, I want to be a minister, and make me a minister today. And we want to make sure that people know our tradition and also can meet the needs of a very diverse congregation. So really that's the hardest part for becoming a UU minister. I was never once questioned about my sexuality. They'll ask questions about it so they want to make sure that I'm not wrestling with internalized homophobia, or that I can certainly have a conversation with people who aren't gay males, right? I can talk to transgender folks, or people who are questioning their genders, or gender non-binary queer folks, and heterosexual people, right? So they want to make sure that I can approach people through all those lenses. In Lexington, it's interesting. So in Chicago, I never really had any opposition in clergy circles. In Concord, Massachusetts, I didn't either. But here in Lexington, there are certain segments of sort of the clergy club, I have no other better way of describing it, that are really hard to enter into. Because both I'm one of the weird ministers in town. I don't solely identify as a Christian, and so me and the other weird ministers in town will hang out. There's a New Thought church and there's a Unity church that they're not the same as us, but we're the weird ministers, and so we'll hang out. But also there are churches that really want nothing to do with me or with our congregation. We've had churches that will interrupt our worship services to protest us. We're down a road that has at least 10 different varieties of Baptist. This is where I know I'm from Chicago. I really don't know the differences between all the Baptists that are right next to each other. I'm sure someone could tell me. Some of them get along great with us, and others are like, we want nothing to do with you. We don't want to talk to you. And that presents a significant challenge. It does make our community feel like a refuge. And refuge is okay, as long as we're not a desert island in the middle of nowhere. We still want to be connected to the community. I feel very assured in my sense of call. When people tell me, wow, that's really weird that you're married to a man and you're a minister, I'm like, well, that's on you. That is on you. I'd love to have a conversation with you about it, but I feel certain in my call, and I am serving the congregations that I have served with authenticity and with the fullest sense of duty to this tradition and to the people that I meet every day.
Well, this is fascinating. I really look forward to a time when I can come to Lexington and worship with you and your congregation. And you've given us a lot to think about today. I know that I don't think there's been a history of any UU churches in Eastern Kentucky. Lexington, and I think maybe Charleston or Huntington is the closest physical fellowships there. But for students who are online today or listening to us, I would encourage you to Google, look on, kind of search out UU, because for those who are exploring, this is a great tradition to identify in or connect with, because there's such space and breadth to explore, ask questions, and you're going to be invited to keep asking, as opposed to getting a sense of surety right away, or you're going to be out. That's not really the UU movement. So Reverend Brian, we really appreciate your time, your scholarship. I know you got a lot you're trying to balance. So good luck with your studies and your DMin. I hope that you can finish up that project and be Dr. Brian very soon. Or I should say Reverend Doctor. And blessings on the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And one final thing to say is, if anyone, you can reach out to me. My email is found on our website, uucl.org, or you can reach out to Reverend Rob here for my contact information. Hey, if you want to talk about the Bible, I love talking about the Bible. If you want to just talk to me more about our tradition, I love talking about it. But I'll leave you with this, right? And I know you can find this both with Reverend Rob and some other people. But if you are struggling with issues of sexuality or gender identity, or even whether or not what your spiritual beliefs are, I need to leave you with this message because it's an important, crucial message. It was a message I received as a youth when I was coming out. Even though I knew I would be affirmed in my tradition, there's still worry because the culture around us tells us so many different things. But I need you to surely know that there's three things that I tell all of our youth, I tell all of our members all the time, and it needs to be, people need to be reminded of this constantly. I need to be reminded of this constantly. So I leave with this, that first, you are loved, right? You are enough, and you're not alone. And seek out people that will affirm those things for you. that will affirm your worth and dignity, that will affirm that you are a whole human being and that you are worthy. And so seek out those communities. It could be a UU community, it could be someone else, but seek out those communities that will affirm you where you are, and will welcome you and will be there for you as you're questioning or as you're discerning where life is taking you. So I leave you with that, and I thank you all, and hope to run into some of you at some point.
All right, have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.